How many of you have heard this term, implicit bias? You have just, okay. That's what I expected. It really has become a very commonly used term. What I hope to do today is actually provide you what I suspect will be a more nuanced perspective on what that term means and how to think about it than you currently have. That's really my goal. Much of the research that I've done over whatever it is, 35 years or so, I hate to think about that number, years of my career, concerns implicit bias in one way or another, at least as I conceptualize the term. And that's because our research has concerned basic issues regarding attitudes. So we ask questions like, how are attitudes formed? How are they represented in memory? How are they activated from memory? So maybe I should presume something I shouldn't. What I mean by an attitude is something very simple. Your likes and your dislikes. Really nothing more than that. How are they formed? How are they represented in memory? How are they activated from memory? Once they're activated, what do they do? What's the consequence of their being activated? Do they affect basic cognitive processes like attention, categorization, perception? Do they affect our interpretation of information, hence our judgments? Do they affect our behavior? Those are the kinds of questions we've asked for these 3 decades or so. And we've developed a model of attitudes and attitude behavior processes that has served as the perspective by which we approach these questions. What I want to do today is present that model to you. And what I hope I will be able to convince you of is that that model allows us a way of thinking about implicit bias. Because what it does is inform our understanding of prejudice and discrimination. And in that way, helps clarify this term, implicit bias. Now, kinds of questions I hope to raise on implicit bias are these. When and how does it arise? Assuming it does arise, can people effectively overcome its influence? Obviously, that should be a very good question. And just what is it? How should we think about it? Many of you probably are familiar with one perspective on implicit bias. It's a perspective that often talks about hidden biases, unconscious attitudes. And the idea is that people aren't even aware that they have a certain kind of like or a certain kind of dislike, aren't even aware that they hold a prejudiced attitude. What I'm going to argue today is that that's inappropriate. Not a conclusion that can be justified on the basis of the evidence. Instead, what I want to suggest is that it's best to think about an implicit bias as an effect of an attitude, once it's activated in a given situation, an effect that you're unaware is happening. Or, if you're not unaware that it's happening, you can't control the influence that it's having on you. So, hopefully by the end, I will convince you that that's an appropriate way to think about implicit bias. Okay, where do we begin? Well, I'm going to actually begin not with some work on attitudes, but with what I regard as a very basic principle of my discipline, social psychology. In my mind, what I'm about to tell you is the essence of social psychology. It is what the whole discipline centers on. And that is that the idea that perception is constructive in nature. Let me illustrate what I mean by that with a few kind of examples that I often use in my undergraduate courses. So, what do you see here? Clearly, A, B, and C.
13.
You can take this, so many of you have seen this before. We can take that center stimulus, which we call easily read as a B, surrounded by numbers, and it easily is perceived as a 13. Same physical stimuli, same sensory input, but in this case, affected by the context. So the context guides our perceptual process. It has an effect on how we integrate that sensory stimuli. So perception depends upon more than the physical stimuli, would be the idea. Now, that's an effect of context. Here's another example. So, what's going on here? What emotion is this person displaying? Okay, I think you very well might think of it as, whoa, pain, anger, sorrow. Any of those seem applicable. And if I were to tell you, as I present this photo to you, that this person just lost a boxing match, I think you'd readily agree that those are the emotions you're seeing. But what if I told you this person had just won a boxing match? That's indeed what's going on here. This is jubilation. It's not sorrow, it's not anguish. This person's celebrating victory. So that's an example of how the expectations that I provided you in advance of your seeing the physical stimuli could have actually affected your interpretation of what was being displayed, your perceptions of those emotions. So expectations. Now, it's not only context and expectations, it's also our hopes, our wishes, our aspirations. Let me illustrate that for you with this slide. Some of you may have seen this photo at some point in your careers. It's possible to view this as a seal. So there's the face, and there's the tail. But it's also possible to view it as a horse. There's the ears, there's the face. Right? And some people tend to see one or the other. Some people can see both. But this is rather ambiguous stimuli that can be perceived in multiple ways. Turns out there are experiments that have been done in which people play a video game. And the video game is set up so that if a farm animal comes up, gain points. You're going to be likely to win the game. This is presented. What do people see? A horse. Same stimuli, but you raise the game, so if a sea animal comes up, you gain points. People are likely to say they see a seal. So people's hopes can actually affect their perceptions. It's also the case that stereotypes and attitudes can affect our perceptions. Here's a rather striking example. This is a real-life example. These are two photos that were taken the day after Hurricane Katrina hit New Orleans. They appeared on Yahoo's website on the very same day. Here's the captions that they appeared with. Two residents wade through chest-deep water after finding bread and soda from a local grocery store. White people find. A young man walks through chest-deep flood after looting a grocery store. Black people looked. Isn't that amazing? It's the same kind of photo, yet how it's captioned is entirely different. That would be a function of stereotypes or attitudes affecting perceptions of what's going on. Okay, those are just examples. The basic message is that what the perceiver brings to a perceptual event can be just as important as the physical sensory stimuli. Much of perception is in the eye of the beholder. It's this that allows for implicit bias. Because our attitudes can potentially affect our perceptions without our even being aware that that is happening. We'll be building upon that theme as we go along. I think this raises a really interesting issue, though. This idea that perception is constructive in nature. Where's the line between perception and judgment? It becomes rather arbitrary now, isn't it? Sometimes we are very much aware that we are judging. So if you're a member of a jury, as I was actually just last week. It's very clear to me that I'm deliberating, I'm judging, I'm trying to assess the truth of the evidence, the truth of the testimony, and what its implications are for the defendant. I know that my job is to make a judgment about the defendant's guilt or innocence. I'm being a judge. That's very clear to me. If you watch a presidential debate, you may be asking yourself, talking to others, about who's winning, who's doing better. Again, we're aware that we're judging, and we're aware that other people may reach a different judgment than we reach. But sometimes that's not the experience we have. Our experience is one of perceiving. We think we're just integrating the perceptual sensory stimuli. We're not aware that our perception may have been influenced because we don't view it as a process of judging, we view it as perception. And this, again, is what's going to allow for implicit bias to allow. Okay, with all that in mind, I want to elaborate on this by introducing you to our model of attitudes. Okay? So, we view an attitude as an association of memory. An association between an attitude object, and the attitude object can be a physical object, it can be a person, it can be a group of people, it can be a policy issue, whatever. But an attitude is an association between that object and your overall summary evaluation of the object. The strength of that association can vary. Provided it's really strong, we would argue that the association is much like well-learned semantic associations that we all develop through the course of our daily lives. So if I say bacon to you, you can't help but think of eggs, right? Salt, pepper, April 15th, taxes. Those are really well-learned semantic associations. We all have them. Our argument is that sometimes attitudes are very much like that. That they're sufficiently strong that the mere presentation of the attitude object is sufficient to automatically activate that evaluation from memory. You don't have to think, you don't have to reflect, oh, is that good or is that bad? It just pops into mind. So I'm sure some of you have had the experience of being among a group of people who are about to order pizza. The inevitable question arises, okay, what kind of toppings are we going to have? And somebody says, how about anchovies? And a bunch of people immediately go, yuck, no, wait, right? They didn't think. There was an immediate reaction to the word anchovies. I happen to love anchovies, but I've had that experience far too many times. But the thought of anchovies led to an immediate yuck reaction. And that is the essence of an automatically activated attitude. The association is so strong in memory that the mere presentation of the object activates the evaluation from memory. Okay, now we argue that, at least under certain conditions, this kind of automatically activated attitude can have a direct impact upon our judgments or behavior. So this is our mode model of the attitude behavior process, and we suggest that at least sometimes judgments or behavior can be a direct function of that automatically activated attitude. Why? Because that attitude got activated, it's now sitting there as that filter through which you're perceiving the world, and it's biasing your perceptions of what's happening at that moment in time, biasing your construals of the event. It's going to lead to an attitudinally consistent construal, and it's that construal that's going to then prompt judgments or behavior. So this can be a direct function. But we also argue that more can go on. And indeed, MODE is an acronym. It's an acronym for motivation and opportunity as determinants of the attitude behavior process. What we want to suggest is that sometimes some motivation may also be invoked in that situation. This can be a number of different kinds of motivation. It could be a motivation to be accurate. I'm making a real important decision. Let's make sure I'm not wrong because it's going to cost me thousands of dollars if I am buying a new car. Okay? It could be a big motivation to do the socially desirable thing. right? To be politically correct. Any number of motivations can arise, but those motivations can actually influence whether this automatically activated attitude does indeed impact judgments and behavior. Opportunity is what we think of as essentially a gate. It's a gating mechanism. If I'm motivated to counter the influence of this automatically activated attitude, that's an effortful process, right? It's a motivated process that takes some resources. I have to have the opportunity to engage in that effortful process. So I have to have the time to do so. Don't rush me. I have to have the resources to do it. Don't ask me to do that if I'm really tired, right? Really fatigued. So the opportunity has to exist so that this effortful motivation process can counter the influence of this automatically activated attitude. Very, very briefly, that's our model. That's our model of the attitude behavior process. Okay, what I want to do now is turn to research that we've done where we've tried to apply this model to issues of racial attitudes and prejudice. First thing we're going to need is a tool, right? A means of measuring this automatically activated attitudes. I can't just ask people what their attitudes are, because that doesn't tell me whether it was sufficiently strong to pop into mind when they encountered the attitude object. I need an implicit measure that allows me to assess whether their attitude was automatically activated and what the nature of that automatic activation was. How many of you have heard of the implicit association test, the IAT? This is a measure, an implicit measure that's received a lot of attention, a lot of media coverage. I actually have some hesitations about the measure, more about how the measure is interpreted than the measure itself. And if there's time at the end, question and answer period, we can get into that. What I'm going to tell you about is the implicit measure that we developed in my laboratory. It actually preceded the development of the IAT by a couple of years. One of the reasons I prefer it over the traditional version of the IAT is that, as I think I'll be able to show you, we have a very good sense of what this measure does, what it is picking up. Okay, so let me introduce the measure to you. The measure involves adjective connotation. When a participant comes into the laboratory, we tell them, you are about to participate in an experiment in which we're going to present you with words, adjectives. Your job is to tell me at each trial whether that adjective means good or bad. What is the connotation of the word? Does it just mean good or bad? Obviously, this is an incredibly easy task, right? Pleasant means good, rotten means bad. People make very, very few errors. I don't care about that. What I'm interested in is the speed, the latency with which they tell me that horrible means bad. What is that latency? How fast can somebody tell me that? That's what we record. We actually record it to the millisecond. Now, I want you to imagine the word horrible is coming up on the screen. So you're going to press bad, right? That's what obviously it means. But what happens if immediately before the presentation of the word horrible, I flash this picture at you? Somebody's already turning away, closing your eyes. Okay. This automatically activates negativity. You didn't need to think about it, it just happened. What have I done by flashing this picture? I've given bad a head start. So if the word that follows this, horrible, is indeed bad, you're going to be all the faster to tell me it means bad. In contrast, if I present that word, that picture in advance, positivity gets activated. You're not ready to say bad. Horrible comes up, you're actually going to be slower. Right?
Unless we're all on a diet.
That's the essence of the test.
Right.
Yes.
Right. Unless we're all on a diet.
Actually, that's a really interesting issue. Working with that. What kinds of people and when people actually construe this as negative because of other kinds of goals that they have. And actually, there's some evidence in the literature showing that effective dieters ones who are successful, actually have come to do that automatically, to have this activate negativity instead of positivity. That's the key to becoming a successful diet.
Sorry to skew the test.
Okay, so returning to our validated priming procedure. The first thing we have people do is that adjective connotation test, as I just described it. They're just seeing words, responding bad or good. We then say, okay, I've now got another test for you to do. Okay? I'm going to present you with faces, photos of people. And I want you to study those faces. They're going to go by relatively quickly on the screen, but study them because in a short time, I'm going to test you. And that's what I then do. Go through a face detection task where I say, here's a photo. Is this an old one that you saw before or a new one? All of that is just to set the stage for the part of the experiment that we really care about, the priming part. Because what we now tell people is this. Okay, if judging word meaning is in fact the kind of automatic skill that we think it is, then you should be able to do that task just as well as you did at the very beginning of the experiment. Even if I give you something else to do at the same time. And the something else is to learn faces. So on each trial, people see a face, very briefly on the screen. It can be an African American, it can be a white, it can be an Asian, it can be a Hispanic. What I care about are the trials involving blacks versus whites. But immediately after that, an adjective is presented, and people have to respond as to whether that adjective means good or bad as fast as possible. This kind of pattern of latencies would be indicative of a prejudice response. Indicative that negativity was automatically activated in response to the photos of blacks. So, if somebody responds to a negative adjective faster when black faces precede them than when white faces precede them, that's a suggestion that negativity got automatically activated in response to the black face. Also, if when presented with a positive adjective, they were slowed down by the presentation of a black face relative to a white face, that would be an indication of negativity. So this kind of pattern is what allows us to infer and index the extent to which negativity has been automatically activated in response to black faces. Everybody with me? Okay, so we use the latencies to basically quantify that, and that index provides our measure of automatically activated attitudes. What I want to tell you about is the very first, not the very first, but one of the first studies that we did using this measure. And in this particular study, we wanted to use our measure of automatically activated racial attitudes, ranging from negative to positive on the basis of people's response levels, to predict people's responses to the modern racism scale. This may be the most commonly used measure of prejudice against blacks. The measure is interesting because it's not in the least, from my perspective. It's interesting because it's not in the least bit subtle. It involves people being presented with statements that are very clearly about blacks and asking whether they endorse those statements. So, to what extent do you agree or disagree with statements of the sort? Over the past few years, blacks have gotten more economically than they deserve. Blacks should not push themselves where they are not wanted. Discrimination against blacks is no longer allowed in the United States. So we're asking people to what extent they endorse these kinds of statements. Verbal behavior. Can we predict people's verbal behavior from our knowledge of their automatically activated racial attitudes? According to the mode model, we should be able to do so, but the other variable that might play a role is motivation. Motivation to control prejudice reactions. So we try to measure that as well. And we do so through a questionnaire, a scale that we measured, created, that really has two components to it. We're basically suggesting that people can be motivated to control their prejudice reactions because they're truly concerned about acting prejudice. So some of the items relate to that, like I get angry with myself when I have a thought or a feeling that might be considered prejudice. So scoring high on this is saying basically that you value egalitarianism. But sometimes people want to control prejudice reactions simply because they want to avoid dispute, to stay out of trouble. I want to be politically correct so that nothing happens. So if I were participating in a class discussion and a black student expressed an opinion with which I disagreed, I'd be hesitant to express my own viewpoint. I'm going to restrain myself so as to avoid the possibility of getting into confrontations with or about blacks. So this is how we measure motivation to control prejudice reactions. We're going to use this, our knowledge of automatically activated racial attitudes, together to try to predict how people respond to these very overt statements about prejudice toward blacks. Here are the data. Let me focus your attention first on the people low in motivation to control prejudice reactions, this blue line. Now, higher numbers on the moderate racism scale indicate more prejudice, so more negativity toward blacks. What you see for people low in motivation to control prejudice reactions is exactly the pattern you would expect. If negativity is automatically activated in response to those black photos, people express more prejudice on the modern racism scale. Exactly the relationship you expect. Interestingly, as motivation to control prejudice reactions increases, the slope of that line gets smaller and smaller, and eventually even reverses. What this enables us to do is to roughly identify, and I do this only for the purpose of elucidating the phenomenon, but it allows us to roughly identify three different kinds of people. Here we have the people that I'm going to call truly unprejudiced. For these people, negativity is not automatically activated when I present them photos of black individuals. If anything, positivity might be activated, but certainly no negativity. So these are people, when they're presented with photos of blacks and whites, are reacting the same way to both. They're truly unprejudiced. This group, I'll call the truly prejudiced. These people have negativity automatically activated in response to black faces, and they have absolutely no qualms about expressing that negativity. Yes, blacks are getting more than they deserve. A particularly interesting group, I think, is this group. And for want of a better term, I'm going to call them the motivated egalitarians. These are people for whom negativity is automatically activated. But they don't appreciate the fact that that's happened. It bothers them that that happened. They're motivated to control that reaction either because they truly are committed to egalitarianism or they want to avoid confrontation. They want to stay out of trouble. And what do? They actually seem to present themselves as even less prejudiced than people for whom negativity is not automatically activated. They actually overcorrect for the influence of their automatically activated negativity. Fascinating process. I mean, as a cognitive scientist, it's just fascinating to me how people could engage in that kind of correction process. But what I want to focus on here is what the implications of that are for the notion of implicit bias. If these people are indeed, as we suspect, engaging in a motivated correction process, don't they have to be aware of what they're correcting from? Don't they have to be aware that is it possible in this situation that their own prejudicial attitude is affecting how they respond to the statements? Certainly. It's that awareness that they could be prejudiced that evokes the motivation in the first place. So right away, I think we have a hint here about how to think about implicit bias. There's some awareness that this is a race-related potential issue where my negativity could be influencing me. And that awareness evokes the motivation, which then can lead even to overcorrection. Again, we're going to elaborate on that as we go along. But this particular pattern we have seen repeatedly in studies in my laboratory. I want to just give you a sense of two other studies in which we have seen this pattern. So one was a study in which we looked at people's willingness to interact with a black in various situations. So we arrived at a list of situations that vary in terms of their intimacy. Some involve more intimacy than others, so going out on a date, sharing a dorm room. Others are just wait staff, maintenance persons. And for each of these, we asked people to imagine that they're just about to enter that situation and to anticipate how comfortable they would be in that situation. And we have them give us a rating of that for each of these situations. We then say, okay, let's return to those situations. And for each one, I want you to imagine a specific interaction partner. So, for example, imagine you need to arrange to hitch a 200-mile car ride through the ride board with a person who is obviously wealthy, with a person who is 30-something, with a person who is in a wheelchair, with a person who is Asian, with a person who is black, with a person who is Hispanic. And what we care about is responses when we specify that the interaction partner is black. What we observe is exactly the pattern that I showed you earlier. Now this time, higher numbers mean more comfort. But if we again start by focusing on the people with low motivation to control prejudice reactions, we see exactly the pattern we expect. The more negativity that's activated in response to black faces, the less comfort I imagine I would feel in those situations interacting with the black. Exactly the relation you'd expect. But as motivation increases, that relationship gets smaller and reverses. Here's our motivated egalitarians. Negativity is automatically activated in response to black faces. How comfortable would I be allowing a black maintenance person into my house? Oh, no problem at all. More so even than people for whom negativity is not active. Okay, so that's just another example of a study in which we find that pattern. One more. First impressions of target photos. What we did in this study is present people with a photograph, pretty rich photo, as I'll show you in a moment. Each photo is presented for 30 seconds, and people are asked to rate the photograph, the target person, on 5 traits. Intelligent, industrious, likable, honest, and reliable. So how good a person is this? How favorable is your impression? And we present photos like this. Black male minister, white male professor, female administrative assistant, female police officer, and so on. Okay? These are the kinds of photos we use. What do we find? I'm not going to bother to present you a graph of the data. Let me describe the data in terms of the mode model. What we found for people low in motivation to control prejudice reactions was this. The judgments, the first impressions, were very much a function of their automatically activated attitudes. For people higher in motivation to control prejudice reactions, we find that overrides the influence of the automatically activated attitude, and they express positivity toward those photos. Okay. Now, in this work, we've taken an individual difference approach to this issue of motivation. The idea that some people are highly motivated to control prejudice reactions, some people are not. But it's also the case that situations differ in the extent to which they either evoke the motivation to control prejudice reactions or allow the opportunity to control. And that's what I want to turn to now. Situations where this motivation is not evoked or opportunity is blocking one's ability to implement a motivational goal. So here's a couple of examples of studies we've done, actually it's only going to be one example, where we find that the relation between automatically activated attitudes and the outcome measure is not moderated by motivation to control prejudice reactions, but instead is solely a direct function of the automatically activated attitude. And this is a case where the motivation is not evoked in the first place because people don't realize that the judgment they're being asked to make is one that's at all race-related. So there's no awareness that you're judging on the basis of race. And in that case, what can happen is that the attitude, automatically activated, can influence your interpretation of the data without you realizing it, and one's motivation to control that process is not evoked because you don't understand that your judgments are potentially affected by your attitudes. Let me give you an example of that. One study where we found that very, very clearly. And this was a study in which people had to judge the quality of candidates to the Peace Corps. They actually received dossiers regarding 4 different candidates. One of them was a white with impeccable credentials, very, very qualified. Another was a white with very poor, very weak credentials. The other 2 candidates both had mixed credentials. Some good points, some bad points. One of them was black, one of them was white. They're the ones we really care about. They're the ones we're going to look at the data. For each of the candidates, people received actually a 4-page dossier. The first page was a resume that included a photograph, so that's how we communicate race. In addition, the white is named Jason and the black is named Jamal. So that's how we get race communicated. The second page of the dossier includes the person's college transcript. Then we have a personal statement that the individual wrote regarding why they wish to join the Peace Corps. And finally, we have a summary report from an individual who interviewed the candidate. So there's a lot of rich data here. I think it's that richness that was critical in this study. Because you're making a judgment on the basis of the data. You've got the college transcript, you've got the personal statement, you've got this interviewer's report. This is not a race-related judgment. But it's still possible for race to have activated people's attitudes and for that to affect one's interpretation of what might be mixed, ambiguous evidence. So the attitude, once activated, can once again influence our perceptions, that constructive process we talked about earlier, and as a result, have an impact upon one's evaluation of the candidate without one realizing that this is even a race-related judgment that you're making. So motivation is not evoked. And that is exactly what we found in this study. Judgments of the candidates were very much a function of automatically activated attitudes, with motivation to control prejudice reactions having absolutely no impact. Again, I think that tells us a little bit about the nature of implicit bias. People aren't aware that the judgment is a race-related one, then implicit bias is very much likely to occur. Okay, so that's an example of a lack of moderation by motivation because motivation is not evoked. There's another way in which we can find a lack of moderation by motivation, according to the mode model, And that has to do with this opportunity factor. Right? Remember, that's the gating mechanism. So if I'm rushed to make a decision, I don't have the opportunity to think carefully, to correct for the influence of my automatically activated attitude. And indeed, there is a considerable amount of evidence in the literature now from experiments in which time pressure is manipulated, or from experiments in which people's resources, their cognitive resources, are depleted. They're made tired, they're fatigued, they're put into a bad mood. And under those circumstances, what you find is a stronger effect of automatically activated attitudes than you otherwise would have. Because under those circumstances, people are going with the shortcuts, right? They don't deliberate, they don't reflect, they don't think about their higher values like egalitarianism. We ourselves studied this in a real-world context, in a egalitarian world. What we looked at was the success of interracial dormitory roommate relationships. I've always found it rather remarkable what we ask two first-year students to do. Two strangers come to a new setting, get plopped into a room, make it work, guys. Make it work. That's really amazing. It gets all the more difficult if we're talking about an interracial dyad. And in fact, we had done some work studying the success of these randomly paired interracial dyads. This was work that we did when I was at Indiana University. And what we discovered, much to our surprise, was that a good number of these relationships actually dissolved. One or the other of the two people in the interracial roommate relationship will move out of the room before the end of the semester. In fact, about 30% of the dyads break up before the end of the semester. And that got us interested in the question of, well, who breaks up? Could we actually predict that on the basis of our measure of automatically activated attitudes? That's what we set out to do. So we identified a sample of about 60 whites who had been randomly paired to share a room with an African American that was a stranger to them. We brought them into the laboratory during the first couple of weeks of the semester, and we had them undergo our measure, value-priming measure of automatically activated racial attitudes. And then we just looked at what happened. How many of those relationships were still intact 10, 12 weeks later when the semester ended? And as I said earlier, about 30% of them were no longer intact. But here's the distribution. So red means that the relationship is dissolved. What I've got on the x-axis here is our estimates of people's automatically activated racial attitudes. And just to walk you through this, let's take this. These are 4 individuals who scored between minus 0.45 and minus 0.35 on our measure of automatically activated racial attitudes, in terms of their latencies and responses to those black faces. Not a single one of them is still living with their African American. All 4 of those relationships have dissolved. Here we have about 7 people who scored around minus 0.3. 3 of the 7 relationships have dissolved. What you can see is that the preponderance of the dissolved relationships are at the negative end of the distribution. So there was a strong relationship between automatically activated racial attitudes and whether the relationship succeeded. Motivation, we also measured that. Motivation to control prejudice reactions? No. It had no effect whatsoever. No relationship with the success of the roommate relationship. And I think that's perfectly sensible. No matter how committed one is to egalitarianism, you cannot monitor your behavior on the kind of day-to-day basis that is involved in sharing a room. You just can't constantly be vigilant to whether you're being prejudiced, acting prejudiced. That just would be exhausting. And in fact, there's going to be days when you're damn tired. There's going to be days when you're in a piss poor mood. You're not going to be able to control any kind of prejudice reactions. So motivation really doesn't get a chance to play out in this kind of environment, but automatically activated attitudes very much do. Any questions?
Did you look at what made the relationships that did stay intact work? Did you follow up with those people? And
It's a tough situation. It'd be very, very important research to do. We didn't want to all lead our participants to believe that we were studying the
Right,
relationship.
that's true.
So we couldn't really
Okay.
inquire too much into that. The little bit of data we had that was relevant to that suggested that when a relationship didn't work, it wasn't so much because of hostility, but instead it was more because people just didn't do anything together. They didn't engage in joint activities. They didn't go to the cafeteria together. They didn't watch TV together or hang out together, that kind of thing. But that's all we know about that. Okay, that's all the data that I want to present you with. But let me try to wrap things up by returning to these questions that I posed. So what does all this have to say about implicit bias? So we asked, when and how does it arise? Well, whenever a strongly associated attitude is automatically activated. That's when it's going to potentially arise. Now, I have focused today on racial attitudes. There's no reason that this model and this approach can't apply to issues regarding gender, to issues regarding other minority groups. But when the attitude is potentially activated from memory, implicit bias can arise. Can it be overcome? Yes. Provided you have the motivation to do so and the opportunity to do so in that given situation. Both of those are necessary to overcome the influence of that automatically activated attitude. Now, what does this suggest about what implicit bias is? I think it suggests that we should not view implicit bias as a hidden unconscious attitude. There's nothing about an implicit measure, be it the IAT or my evaluative priming procedure, that permits the conclusion that people are unaware of their attitude, unaware that they are racially prejudiced. What they're unaware of is that you are measuring their attitude at that moment in time. It's the measure that's implicit, not the attitude. It's not the construct that's implicit, it's the measure that's implicit. So this doesn't seem appropriate. Moreover, as we argued earlier, if people are engaging in this kind of motivated correction process, they've got to be aware that there's something to correct for. They've got to be aware that they are potentially being biased by their racial attitudes. So clearly they are aware of what their attitude is. So instead, I want to argue that it's best to think of implicit bias as an effect of an automatically activated attitude in a given situation, an effect that you're unaware is happening. Or alternatively, even if you are aware it's happening, you can't control it because of that lack of opportunity. Now, this may seem subtle, it may seem to be a more nuanced perspective that is necessary, it may seem like I'm trying to make distinctions that aren't very, very important or significant, but I think they really are. And I think they're important for both the science and the politics of implicit bias. So in terms of the science, if we start inferring that anytime we use an implicit measure, that we've measured a hidden attitude, that's going to affect how we think about phenomena. It's going to affect how we frame our research questions, how we interpret our data. Yet there's no reason, no necessary reason for believing that to be the case, just because we use an implicit measure. So it's important to the science that we think about this appropriately. It's also important to the politics. One of the things that's always disturbed me about this notion of hidden biases is that it seems to imply that the individual is not responsible, right? Oh, I didn't know I was prejudiced. That's not me. I knew nothing about this. Well, an attitude, person's kind of right to be able to take that stance, right? That just does not seem appropriate to me. People should be held responsible for their judgments and their behavior. This permits us to take that kind of perspective on the politics of implicit bias. To say you are responsible if you're not aware that your attitude is potentially affecting you in a given situation. So it's not only the science, but it's also the politics. We don't want to absolve people of responsibility for their prejudiced attitudes. So that too is, I think. All right, I'm going to stop there. I thank you for your time. I don't know if we have more time or not, but I'm more than pleased to take questions if people have. Yeah.
So then, have you studied, or do you have an impression that if you enhance motivation and you enhance opportunity, you then can raise the likelihood that that attitude would adjust?
We have not directly done that. I haven't designed intervention programs to do that, but that's certainly the suggestion.
Yeah.
This program of basically switching class.
Yeah.
There are some other social psychologists have done work where the primary goal is indeed to enhance people's awareness of their current, and that tends to have that consequences. But again, it often depends upon what are the cues in any situation, and are people sensitive to the possibility that race is relevant to that judgment?
You can control it in a teaching situation, but in real life, that maybe.
I think that Peace Corps study is very telling.
Yeah.
When people got a lot of information, I don't think necessarily that their judgment's been affected by anything but the data.
Yeah.
Of course, this is what I'm judging.
Outside of the law, so I've been following the police relations with municipal cops. And we now have police cameras. And a lot of the ways we talk about these police cameras are, oh, this is an option, I mean, we're gonna, catch you doing something that you shouldn't be doing. But now looking at your model, I've changed the way I'm looking at it. I'm not looking at it, we're providing the police with the opportunity, right, to do what should be done in a certain situation. So this has already blown that I'm now looking at those cameras as a tool of opportunity, not as a gut. We now have evidence we have something we should have been doing. Because we have had discussions about motivation. And we do know we have police who are motivated, right, to recognize their biases and to use them, and that opportunity
That's a very, very good point. The other situation, the other factor in that kind of situation that's going to be very important is that there be a time pressure. So often, the police officer has to make some decision very immediately without the time to reflect. So that's exactly the kind of situation where automatically activated attitudes are going to be really important when it's a momentary decision that's got to be made. And that's going to be very difficult to counter.
So we're also not even thinking about the police shifts. How long are you on shifts? How exhausted are you by the time you're having to make
Yes,
that
that's a good point. Sure. Sure.
Thank you very much.
Early in the shift, somebody should be more likely to be able to engage in this. Yeah, very good point.